3. Norman was one of those early birds which catch the proverbial worm. Running the down-at-heel corner tobacconists at anything remotely resembling a profit was pretty much a full-time occupation. Norman went about it, as he did with everything else, with a will. One must remain constant in the field if one wishes to ladle off the cream which is one's bread and butter, he constantly explained to his customers. This remark generally met with enough thoughtful head-nodding to offer the shopkeeper the encouragement he needed. Norman had been up since 6, sorting through and numbering up the day's papers. It was Wednesday and the first crop of specialist journals had arrived. There was the psychic news for Lily at the Plume Café. This Norman numbered in large red figures, as the new paperboy had the irritating habit of confusing it with cycling news and delivering it to Father Moiety at St. John's. There was the regular welter of sporting mags for Bob the bookie, and a selection of Danish glossies for Uncle Ted the greengrocer. Norman folded a copy of Muscle Boys into the widow Cartwright's Daily Telegraph and hummed softly to himself. There was a busy day ahead, and he intended to take advantage of it each and every minute. Nick, the big-nosed paper-boy, sidled into the shop, chewing gum and smoking what the lads at the yard refer to as the certain substances. "Kudos, Norm," he said. Norman looked up from his doings and eyed the youth with evident distaste. "Good morning, Nicholas," he said, giving his watch minute scrutiny and rattling it against his ear. "Can that be the time already, or is the old Vacheron Constantine running fast again?" The paperboy flicked idly through a copy of Bra-Busting Beauties. "Look at those Charlies," he said, salivating about the gums. "You'd think you'd gone deaf, eh?" Norman thrust the bundle of folded papers into the worn canvas bag and pushed it across the worm-eaten counter. "Away on your toes, lad," he grunted. "Time heals all wounds, and absence make the heart grow fonder." "Oh, it do," the lad replied, sweeping up the bag in an eczema-coated fist and bearing it away through the door like the standard of a captured enemy. "It do that." Norman watched his departure with sorrow. There was something decidedly shifty about that boy, but he couldn't quite put his finger on exactly what. The shopkeeper crossed the mottled linoleum floor and turned the close sign to open. Soon they would arrive, he thought, as he peered through the grimy door-glass. The office girls for their cigarettes and chocolate bars, the revellers of the previous night for their aspirins, the school lads for their comics and penny toffees, the old dears for the pints of milk Reg the milkman had neglected to leave upon their steps, Old Pete for his half-ounce of tobacco, Polly and O'Malley for 5 woodbines on their weekly accounts, the same old regular morning faces. Norman shook his head thoughtfully. It wasn't a bad old life if you didn't weaken, was it? And a trouble shared was definitely a trouble halved, and you had to laugh, didn't you? Retracing his steps to the counter, he selected one of the newer brands of bubblegum that the local rep had persuaded him into stocking. Stripping away the wrapper from the stick of Captain Laser Astral gum, he thrust a gaudy piece of synthetic sweetmeat into his mouth. Chewing distractedly, he drifted about his shop, flicking without conviction at the dust-filled corners and blowing the falling residue from the faded coverings of the out-of-date chocolate boxes which lined his shelves. Here was the Queen smiling sweetly, if somewhat faintly, at her coronation. Here 2 stuffed-looking Scotties peered through the rust from a shortbread biscuit tin, and here was the Pickwickian character still grinning idiotically at all that uneatable cough-sweet. Norman drew a bespittled finger across the old tin's surface in an attempt to bring up the brand name. Did people still eat sweeties like this, he wondered, or had they ever? He couldn't recall ever having sold any. Out of sudden interest, he picked up the old tin and gave it a shake. It was empty, of course. Probably evaporated, he thought. Norman shrugged once more. He really ought to sling them all out. They served little purpose and could hardly be described as decorative. But he knew he would never part with them. They gave his shop character and were always good for inspiring conversation from the lonely pensioners who happened by, upon some pretext or another, only really wanting a bit of a chat. Norman thrust his one-feathered duster back into its appointed niche and flexed his shoulders as if in an attempt to free himself from the strange melancholia which filled him this morning. Things were going to change in Brentford, and it was little good in crying over spilt milk or whistling down the wind. Upon the counter lay the small brown package which small Dave had delivered. Norman knew exactly what it contained. The American stamps and spidery Gothic lettering told him well enough. This was the last component he required, the final tiny missing piece of the jigsaw. This was a make or break. Several years of planning and many, many months of hard and exacting work had gone into this, not to mention the small fortune spent upon research, preparation, and final construction. This experiment was indeed the big one. It was a Nobel Prize job this time, and no mistake. Norman had named it the ultimate quest, and it was indeed a goodie. Certainly, in the past, Norman's little scientific diversions had not been altogether successful. In fact, he'd been something of a figure of fun because of them. But this time, he was sure he had cracked it. The people of Brentford would certainly sit up and take notice of this one. If his calculations, combined with those of a certain Germanic physicist, not altogether unknown for his theory of relativity, proved to be correct, then things were going to be very different indeed hereabouts. Norman patted the tiny brown package. If all was present and correct, he would begin the first practical working test this very early closing day. Then we would see what we would see. The shop bell rang in a customer. It was old Pete with his half-terrier Chips as ever upon his heels. "Morning, Norman," said the ancient cheerily. "Half answers Chips, if you will." The shopkeeper replied, for the first time becoming aware that the Captain Laser astrogum had suddenly set hard in his mouth, welding his upper plate to his lower set. "Grumph?" queried old Pete, scratching at his snowy head. "Now what could it be this time? Let me guess. Experimenting with some advanced form of Esperanto, is it? Or having a try at being a ventriloquist?" Norman clutched at his jaw and grew red about the jowls. His eyes began to roll. "Oh," said old Pete, tapping at his nose, "I think I'm beginning to get the measure of it. Something in mime, isn't it? Now let's have a go. I'm quite good at this. Give me a clue now. How many words in the title?" Norman tore at his welded teeth and bashed at the countertop with a clenched fist. "5 words," said old Pete. "No, 6. 7. Is it a film or a book?" Norman lurched from the counter in a most grotesque fashion, grunting and snorting. Old Pete stepped nimbly aside as he blundered past, while young Chips sought a safe hidey-hole. "It's a poser," said the old one, as Norman threw himself about the shop, toppling the magazine stand and spilling out its contents. I have it, he cried suddenly. "It's the now legendary Charles Laughton in his famous portrayal of Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame." In hearty congratulations for Norman's excellent impersonation, the old man, who still retained a considerable amount of strength in his right arm, despite his advancing years, slapped Norman upon the back. The blow loosened the cemented teeth, which flew from the shopkeeper's mouth, tumbled noisily across the linoleum, and finally came to rest in an impenetrable place beneath the counter, where they lay in the darkness, grinning ruefully. "Thank you," spluttered Norman. "Thank you, Peg." "Credit where credit is due," the elder replied. "My tobacco now, if you please." Norman staggered to the counter and tore out a 1-ounce packet from the tin. "I shall," he whistled through his naked gums. "I shall." Old Pete, who was never a man to look a gift impersonator in the mouth, accepted his reward with a hasty display of gratitude and departed the shop at speed. Halfway up the ailing road, young Chips unearthed a pristine copy of Brow-Busting Beauties from its secret hiding-place beneath the beer crate outside the Swan. "This is all the makings of being a most profitable day," said the ancient to his furry companion. Young Chips woofed non-committally. Being naturally clairvoyant, he sensed something rather to the contrary, and therefore wished to reserve judgment for the present.